everyone. We welcome you all to this great session on Prevention of Corruption Act. Today, we will not only be dealing with an overview of the Prevention of Corruption Act, but we will also deal with the nitty-gritties of the Act. We will take you to the historical perspective of the Prevention of Corruption Act, from the Mauryan period to Indian Penal Code 1860 to the latest legislation. We'll also touch upon the point that when there was already an existing legislation, why there was a need to amend the legislation. And now, whether the legislation is enough to curb the prevention, to curb the corruption in our country. We'll also take you and decode various sections of Prevention of Corruption Act for you. We will deal that whether demand and acceptance of illegal gratification is important to make someone liable under the Prevention of Corruption Act. We will deal with what is the public servant, what is an public official duty. We will be dealing with the basic concepts. Apart from these, we will also deal whether the introduction of sanction, even for investigation and inquiry, will be an interference or will help the public servant that they not suffer an unnecessary harassment. We'll also talk about why the bribe giving has now been made an offense, whether the act is trying to make a distinction between coercive bribe and coercive bribe. So we'll deal with a lot more today in this session. So please stay tuned till the end of this session. And today we are pleased and privileged that we have been joined by senior advocate Vivek Tankhaji. So I've personally watched a lot of your interviews in all the news channels and listened to your speech. So it has always been a great learning whenever I listen to you. And I certainly believe that today also, all our viewers will learn a lot from your rich experience. Sir, we welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are also pleased that we have been joined by Advocate Bharat Bhushan ji. Sir, we thank that you have again joined us. In last session also, it was great and it was a lot of learning when you have been telling us about the tricks, about the rules and different practical aspects, how we should conduct an cross-examination, what should be done when we are preparing. And today also, I know that when you will take us to different aspects of this law, we will have great learning from your practical experience. Sir, we welcome you. We are also pleased that we have been joined by President of Rouse Avenue Bar Association, Advocate Arunji. Sir, we welcome you. We have also been joined by Mr. Siddharth, Secretary, Rouse Avenue Bar Association, and also Advocate Sunil Ji, who is the convener of this webinar series. Sir, we welcome you all. As we have already stated in our earlier session also that this is an uncertain situation, that everything is under lockdown and so much negativity is there, and we are going through a lot of tough times. So this is just an initiative, a platform that we are trying to create where we can contribute to our learning and growth. We'll request all our professional colleagues, please suggest us that what all topics you will like that we should conduct our next webinar on. And I'll request, so please subscribe to our channel and also Rouse Avenue page on Facebook so that you get the latest update of all our webinars. So now I'll request our president of Rouse Avenue Bar Association. So please, sir, tell us something about the association. So please.
Audible?
Yes, sir. You're audible, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I welcome all the participants or viewers of this webinar who are keen to learn on this particular topic. Now, I would like to say that Rose Avenue Court Bar Association is organizing the second webinar with the kind cooperation of our senior esteemed colleague, Sri Bharat Bhushan Ji, Advocate Supreme Court of India. I extend my sincere thanks for him and his entire team, and ma'am also. During these hard days, it is observed that many of our advocate brother colleagues were found corona positive. I pray for the speedy recovery. Rose Avenue Court have a number of young advocates who are keen to learn. All the courts dealing such matters under Prevention of Corruption Act are functioning in Rose Avenue Court complex. During these hard days, as you all are aware, that all the courts are not functioning as usual. So, to utilize the time, this Bar Association is organizing such type of webinar with the kind cooperation of Sri Bharat Bhushan and his associates. I am happy to inform you that a renowned leader, a great personality, a senior advocate Sri Vivek Tankhaji, Rajya Sabha MP and former Solicitor General of India is with us. He will enlighten us on the said topic. Sri Vivek Tankhaji is the master of topic. He is known to his name. I extend my sincere thanks for sparing this valuable time to enlighten us. Again, I welcome Sri Bharat Bhushan Ji, Guruji, who had a vast knowledge on different topics in cross-examination, Prevention to Corruption Act, etc., etc. He is master of cross-examination also. I request to all the participants have a short clapping in the honor of Sri Vivek Tankhaji, Senior Advocate, and Sri Bharat Bhushan Ji. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. It is a great initiative that the Rouse Avenue Bar Association has taken. Now, I'll request Advocate Sunil Kumar Ji to please open and talk briefly about our webinar series. So please. So you're not audible.
His voice may have been muted.
Thank you. As mentioned like last time, in order to help our members and our fraternity in the ways possible and with the strong desire to make best of the current times, we at Rouse Avenue Bar Association conceived of conducting webinars which we believe will help our members to learn on various relevant subject matters. Accordingly, my dear friends, we have come up with the idea of conducting webinar series wherein we are inviting speakers to share their experience and subject knowledge on current relevant subject matters. We believe that this will go long way in learning from experienced luminaries for our young members. For each webinar, the first task is always to find out relevant topics and speakers on the topic. Fortunately, in no time, we could request our speaker, a great personality, very humble, and who has always been very supportive to the young advocates, Shri Advocate Vivek Tankhaji, who is also Member of Parliament at Rajya Sabha, and Advocate Shri Bharat Bhushan Ji, and got their confirmation. We have to equip ourselves technically to conduct these webinars, for which we got support from Bharat and Associates. With everybody's contribution, we could bring this webinar series to you. I believe that today's webinar is going to be an interesting one, and shall be meaningful for our professional colleagues practicing at Rouse Avenue Court Bar or any other bar in India which deals with the Corruption of Prevention Act. We request and look forward to your participation and request you to make best out of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Now I'll request Advocate Siddharth to please introduce our speakers.
Good evening to all. Our first speaker is Shri Vivek Tankhaji, Senior Advocate, and he is also sitting member of Parliament at Rajya Sabha and is a well-known legal luminary. Mr. Tankha was designated senior by full court of the High Court in 1999. Sir is one of the youngest Advocate General of Madhya Pradesh. Mr. Tankha was one of the youngest AG of Madhya Pradesh. Mr. Tankha was also the first lawyer from Madhya Pradesh to have been appointed Additional Solicitor General of India. Sir had been representing the whistleblower in Vyapam scam case of Madhya Pradesh. His list of achievements is too long, and even the entire session will be too short to describe all of that. He certainly needs no introduction. Sir had started his legal career in the year 1979. He is also known for his immense amount of social work in education for children with special needs and free health camp for the blinds. He had also been instrumental in promoting legal education in the country. With his rich experience, we are very sure we will learn a lot. With this short introduction, I heartily welcome Senior Advocate Mr. Vivek Tankhaji. Our second speaker is Advocate Bharat Bhushan sir, who last time spoken on art of cross-examination and readily agreed this time to dwell on the concept of Prevention of Corruption Act, keeping in view the recent new avatar of the Act. I am pleased to share with you all that he had been a litigation lawyer for last more than 20 years and has represented clients before various trial courts and high courts in India. He has also represented his clients in the infamous case of Tehelka sting operation and many more such cases, which were under the erstwhile Prevention of Corruption Act. He has been for years representing his clients in various white-collar crimes under Prevention of Corruption Act and other similar provisions and acts. Though this year he had known his close circle to have understood the nerve of being a defense lawyer on these matters. As said by Sunil ji, with everybody's contribution, this series have been brought forward, and it is particularly the support from Senior Advocate Shri Vivek Tankhaji and Seasoned Advocate Bharat Bhushan sir, and technical support from Bharat and Associates have been instrumental in doing these programs. We thank them all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite our first speaker, Senior Advocate Vivek Tankhaji. So it will be a great learning experience, and especially for our young members like me, to listen from you. Sir will speak upon whether the existing legislation is able to curb corruption in our country. You know, there's a say that prevention is better than cure. So is the legislation sufficient enough to prevent corruption? Sir, it will be going to be a great pleasure learning from you, sir. So please.
Thank you, Sakshi. Thank you so much. And let me thank the Rouse Avenue Bar, the president, Arun ji, the secretary, Siddharth ji, my friend Sunil Kumar ji, and somebody I respect so much, Bharat Bhushan ji, and all our viewers. In fact, when I'm invited to address or visit a bar association, I never feel that I'm going to a new place. For me, bar is always a family and remains a family. मेरे लिए तो परिवार ही होता है bar. And when you talk of Delhi bar, Rouse Avenue bar, after all, is part of the Delhi bar. This is now a fairly old bar. It has produced a lot of illustrious lawyers, and especially on the criminal side, now that I'm addressing a bar essentially on the criminal side. I remember Dinesh Mathurji. I mean, I've had long associations with him since when I was a student. He used to be a friend of my chacha, Manmohan Kishan Kaul Sahab, Justice Kaul's dad, and Neeraj's dad. And they were all batchmates. I mean, he and Justice Kirpal and Mr. Mathur. That was a group which used to meet every Saturday in their house. I was a student at that time. Then I still meet him. He's much older now, but yes, he's still there. I wish him good long life. I knew Sushil Kumarji quite well. He's not with us, but I used to find him a very compact lawyer, whether it was High Court, Trial Court, or Supreme Court. Ram Jethmalani ji was essentially Bombay, but practiced a lot in Delhi. He did a lot of trials in Delhi, a lot of appeals in Delhi. So had opportunity to work with him, also against him. It was always a pleasure. Lalit Saab is was somebody who was very good in criminal law, UU Lalit, and his father, of course, was also there. And Lalit Saab, again, I remember conducting so many trials and arguing so many appeals. We also had opportunity to oppose each other sometimes. And the one person I would really like to speak today about is Rajendra Singh ji. He was from Madhya Pradesh, a doyen of the bar. And those were the days I'm talking of, late 70s, early 80s, when two people used to dominate this firmament of criminal law, Rajendra Singh ji and Jethmalani ji. All important matters at that time, if you recollect, they would be on either side, one of the two sides. As a law student, I remember attending the trial of Kissa Kursi Ka and Tees Hazari. This is 78, because I graduated from Campus Law Center, Delhi. And I still remember the two distinct styles of advocacy of criminal law. One was Ram Jethmalani, other was Sardar Rajendra Singh. Two doyens. It was like a clash of two doyens, but you never felt it was a clash. Bharat Bhushan ji would testify to that, I'm sure. He must have had some experiences. There were moments where Ram Jethmalani, in his usual fiery style, would, be up in arms in court, getting angry, protesting, complaining. And Rajendra Singh ji, with his suave British barrister type of advocacy, would bring the tempers down. And the moment, I remember, it would be lunch break, and before even the court could rise, Rajendra Singh ji would look at Ram and say, "Ram, let's go and have a cup of coffee." Now that is how bar used to respond, even in those most contested matters, which I don't see now. The level of that advocacy and the acrimony that I see today, it's quite different. While these people fought the biggest of battles, but that was only in the court. Moment the court time was over, they came out as friends. I also remember one day, I was a student, so I used to just go to watch them, because watching these people also is learning, by the way. So I used to just sit and watch in court. Rajendra Singh ji had to take an adjournment because Kissa Kursi Ka had continued for a very long time. And he had to keep coming from Jabalpur by train. Those days we didn't have flights. And it was not easy because he had dates in Madhya Pradesh and other states also. And to give so much time on this case was difficult. So he was just discussing with me. He says, Vivek, today I'll have to ask for an adjournment. I'm just wondering how to do it. And then he asked for a cup of coffee. I think I'm forgetting the name of the judge, very fine judge who in the trial court. Bharat Bhushan ji, was it Mr. Vora? Or what was his name? If you remember, the judge who was hearing that trial, trying that case, Kissa Kursi Ka and 30,000 at that time. Very fine person. So I recollect he asked for a cup of coffee. And as soon as the judge came out, Rajendra Singh ji, virtually got up and started apologizing. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I couldn't have asked for a cup of coffee while my lords are coming in. It's absolutely incorrect on my, and it was deliberately done, by the way. And I'm sorry. And he started turning and taking his cup out. And the judge would say, Sardar Sahab, don't worry, Sardar Sahab, please sit down. It's okay. And after 3 minutes, he asked the judge, I want a short adjournment. He said, no problem, Sardar Sahab. How beautifully they used to play on the psychology of a judge in a very sweet manner. Now, that is the advocacy that I'd seen at that time. These people were brilliant, in their arguments, in their approach to court. They knew how to convince a court. And why I'm saying all this is because I'm addressing maybe a lot of youngsters today who might be part of the audience. And they should know that 50% of court craft is advocacy, if 50% is skill. It's your court manners, it's your approach, it's your conduct, it's your demeanor, what you wear, how you carry, how you sit, how you walk in, how you walk out. I think the judge is observing everything. And the people who have become big lawyers or big names in the field of law are people who have practiced this in life. Once I asked Sardar Rajendra Singh ji, I was his junior for a short while before I branched out on my own in Jabalpur. I said, sir, how did you become such a good speaker? Nothing is natural in life, by the way. Nobody is born with a silver spoon. Everybody needs to learn. And he says, Vivek, I spent a lot of hours in my young days standing before a mirror and addressing the court. I used to see my expressions. I used to see my eyes. I used to see my face. I used to see how my lips move. Now, this is how real advocates were built. I still remember this was in 89 or 90, flying in a charter plane to Jabalpur with Dr. L.M. Singhvi, father of Abhishek. He had to start a case and then I had to continue with that matter. Some big important matter. So while we were traveling, he was asking me, tell me which is that bench, who are the judges, did they come from the bench or the bar, what is their, how do they conduct themselves, what are they fond of, what do they want to hear. They would go into such details about the judge before actually going to the court. So the first thing I would advise my young bar and my young friends is, prepare yourself to be a very good lawyer and prepare yourself to be before the judge in the most presentable form. If you do these two things well, 50% of your battle is won. The next 50% is law, which obviously you are learning and you would keep learning. I also would say that I learned a lot of law on the criminal side as a young lawyer. I had opportunity to do even murder trials in the beginning. But gradually, as my practice grew, it branched off to constitutional law, writs, company matters, and there was less time to attend to criminal briefs. But again, when I became the Advocate General of the state in 1999, February 1999, for 5 years, that was undivided state of Madhya Pradesh at that time. As an Advocate General, you get a lot of opinions which have something to do with criminal law, especially actions under the Lokayukt Act, points of sanction, points of prosecution. And this again got repeated when I became Additional Solicitor General from 2009 to 2012, when in a lot of matters I was also Special Counsel for the CBI. I had opportunity to travel to different parts of India as CBI counsel also, in Supreme Court also. So I said, overall, it was a good experience, and every experience is a good learning experience. Nobody can say in this world that I'm a complete lawyer. Nobody is a complete lawyer. Not even the judge hearing the case is a complete lawyer. One of the greatest jurists of India was Justice G.P. Singh. Bharat Bhushan ji, he is the one whose book would you find in every office of a lawyer in India, interpretation of statutes. A real saint judge, बहुत saintly आदमी थे, बहुत संत आदमी. And I still remember as a young lawyer appearing in his court and reading, giving him an interpretation of 299 and 300 IPC. What is intent, what is knowledge, what is imminent danger, without opening the book. So he tells me, young man, let me tell you one thing. Don't ever think that you know the 3 lines by heart. Every time you read that section in the court, you will get a new dimension. A dimension which helps you in the interpretation of your case, the facts of your case. So these are points which I learned from these great people, always. I recollect Justice J.S. Verma, very strict man. He was like that in Supreme Court also. He was one of our senior judges. I mean, we were as youngsters privileged to appear before the best judges in Madhya Pradesh, who were the best judges in the country. And people were scared to appear in his court. He was very harsh, very rude. So, but I still remember we were the only 2 young boys willing to go to his court. One was me and the other was Abhay Sapre. Abhay retired as a Supreme Court judge recently. And the 2 of us used to get the maximum admonition in court. But with every admonition we learned, because we made sure that it wouldn't come back again. His insistence was that as a young man, if you quote a case, don't quote me the last case. Tell me from the first to the last. You can't do a shortcut with me, he says. That you just read a placitum of Supreme Court and you're telling me the law. Tell me what was the Privy Council on that law. Now, this is what I want to tell the young people. Whether it be confession, whether it be admission, whether it be any facet of criminal law, intention, knowledge, anything. Every case had a beginning somewhere. Every point had a beginning somewhere. From where it began, those famous judgments, start reading from there and come to the last. You'll be more confident in court after that when you're arguing. So all in all, I would say that it's a great experience to be on the criminal side. You have the advantage that your law is then confined to not too many books. आजकल दिन बदल गया. पहले तो पुराने जमाने में it was CRPC, IPC and Evidence Act, and later on PC Act. पहले 4 ही किताब थी पुराने जमाने में. अब तो व्हाइट कॉलर ऑफेंसेस आ गए हैं और 50 ये मनी लॉन्ड्रिंग से लेकर एंड सीबीआई ऑफेंसेस से लेकर कोपे फोसा, ये दुनिया भर के अब तो इतने सारे लॉज बन चुके हैं कि आप लोगों के लिए इवन it is like being a civil lawyer now, practically. I mean, you see as many laws. So before I start something on CRPC, I would like to say, on PC Act, I would like to say that my experience was that this law also kept changing with passage of time. When I entered the court in 1980, we were still under the old Act, 47 Act, if you remember. Before 47, we were governed by the Indian Penal Code, which was of 1861, I think, or 67 vintage. Yeah, I think 61 vintage. And there were six sections, if I remember correctly, 161 to 169 or something, which governed all facets of corruption. Public servant was also defined, and the sections which would cover the punishment were also those 6 sections, that nothing more. Post World War II, governments realized that this has a bigger dimension than just IPC. And that is how it gave birth to the new 1947 Act. But Bharat Bhushan ji, you would also recollect, that was a very short act. It didn't have too many sections.
Yes.
1947 Act. I think 6 or 8 sections, I remember. And it also practically substituted most of it that was an IPC, but not too much of additions. Maybe, I think, sanction or something the point of sanction must have come at that time. And then the next jump was 88, when a new jurisprudence was sought to be put forth as a Prevention of Corruption Act, with lot more sections, lot more provisions, which finally, recently, when we were in Parliament, there was a debate. I would say, of course, there were amendments many times in between. Those are small amendments. That the recent 18 Act amendments. So this actually completes the picture of how PC Act developed. 1861, then 47, then 1988, and 2018. These are the major developments. Most of you people who are part of this webinar today are, I would say they are all experts. They've read this law well. So I really don't need to go into every section or every part of this law. But there are some facets which I would like to discuss and put it for your thought process. A new section which has cropped up is 17A. Now 17A, if you see, this is inserted in 2018. Now this says, no police officer shall conduct any inquiry or investigation into any offence alleged to have been committed by a public servant under this Act, where the alleged offence is relatable to any recommendation made or decision taken by such public servant in discharge of his official functions or duties without the previous approval. In the case of central government, it is central government. In the case of state government employees, it is the state government. Now, this is something which we all need to discuss a little more. If you remember, the genesis of this comes from the 2-line ban on investigation on joint secretary efforts without permission or prior approval. When this was pointed out to Justice J.S. Verma during Hawala, if you recollect, the Supreme Court came down with a ton of bricks. He says, what nonsense? Why should the government, which maybe is involved in the entire episode, now the investigating agency whose proceedings we are monitoring, they will take their permission, and that permission can be withheld, so there is no investigation? How can that happen? Logically, it should not happen in a civilized world. So that is the first time Supreme Court came with a ton of brick and said this in that Vineet Narayan judgment, that this such a provision which makes a distinction between joint secretaries and others, and in any case stops investigation or puts the investigation at the mercy of the government. Such a 2-line ban or such a 2-line restriction is contrary to law, will not be applicable, and the CBI is given full authority to proceed against all. That is how it started. But there was an amendment. Governments don't work. These governments don't work as per the court diktat. They always work as per their interests. They are looking for their own safety nets. So in 2003, they came with an amendment, and they brought in this same restriction of prior approval of investigation by virtue of a law. Earlier, I believe it was it may have been a guideline or an executive order. So they brought in a law. This law was then challenged sometime later. I think it was in 2014. It was a constitutional bench judgment of Justice Lodha, 5 judges bench. They said, how can you do it? Didn't the court say that this is contrary to the tenets of criminal law? And why are you making an invidious distinction between joint secretaries and downwards? If on the same note sheet, a joint secretary cannot be investigated, but a deputy secretary can be investigated. What is the justification? A secretary cannot be investigated, but a section officer can be investigated on the same note sheet. Looks very peculiar. So Supreme Court at that time struck down this section as unconstitutional. This is, I think, in 14, the constitutional bench judgment. Justice Loda's, he headed that bench at that time, and said that it does not fit with our constitutional mandate of Article 14. It creates a special class of people within the constituency of bureaucrats, and also against the tenets of and the principles of PC Act. But this is more important, that such a restriction is against the tenets of PC Act. That is, you are keeping the power to even commence investigation in your hands. So today, and then what happened? In the new law, which they've again brought, and this time it's a blanket ban. All investigations or inquiries against a public servant cannot start till the government gives approval. So now government can also selectively decide in which case to give approval, which case not to give approval. You want to fix the opposition, give approval in only opposition cases. If you want to protect the ruling party, don't give approval in ruling party cases. No, law cannot work on the basis of parties, especially criminal law. Criminal law works on the basis of actions that have to be taken to protect the state. The offense under the criminal law is offense against the state. It's not against a party. It's a state offense. State is the prosecutor. That is why I always felt, and I always say this in Parliament also, when I get an opportunity. In America, a president can be prosecuted on the basis of an advice of an attorney general. The district prosecutor is a very powerful man in America. Even the president cannot dictate to a district prosecutor. Why can't we have such a system in India? Why are we subordinate to these political forces and vagaries? Why can't we have a criminal justice system which protects, preserves, and enhances the values of the Indian Constitution? We want a corruption-free government, a state. There can never be corruption-free state ever, but as far as possible, as much as possible. In a list of 180 countries of Transparency International, where perception of corruption index is given about various countries of the world, we are 80, with China and Sub-Saharan and Morocco. Okay? Sub-Saharan countries in Morocco. I don't think it's something we should congratulate ourselves for. And we should be amongst the first 5, 10, 15, 20. We must have a civilized setup. So that's what I'm trying to say again, that in India, the problem is the government's always wanting to protect themselves. The government officers always wanting to protect themselves. And the corruption is qua them. PC Act is not for private individuals, basically. It was for government officials, public officials. But today, the only people who can be prosecuted and investigated under the PC Act without impediments are the commercial organization, the private people, the new amendment. Public officials for whom this act was meant are protected with restrictions on investigation and later sanction. So first part is that the 17A, I feel, needs to be challenged at some point of time before the court someday. Maybe it may have been challenged already, I'll have to find out, but it needs to be challenged. Whether governments can keep this power with themselves. And the larger question is also going to be the autonomy of the police. Prakash Singh's case. I always believe, and I've been telling all my chief ministers also, that you can't have a police arrangement where the TI is also the investigator. In the morning, he goes to receive the ministers at the railway station. He's part of the convoy. And in the afternoon, he's investigating a 302 case. It can't happen. I mean, your investigation wing and your policing wing has to be separate. The Supreme Court has given this mandate, this judgment long years back, asking all states to implement it. But still, it hasn't been done in most of the states. It continues to be the same. All police stations function for both aspects. I mean, whether it's Delhi, the same police station, you go to a Lodi Garden police station, or what do you call them? Any police station, they are policing and they're also investigating. It has to be separated. Then another point that I would like to make is that 17A by itself being bad enough, you have to look at now 13. Now 13, section 13, if you see section 13, it sounds the death knell of PC Act. You ask me why. If you look at the old PC Act, section 13 had 4 clauses. It had a huge compass. You could investigate even cases where from the orders that were issued, you could presume corruption. It was so atrocious on the face of the record. It's like I decide to give a huge contract without following a public process. Obviously, it's wrong. It's criminal. If I'm a minister or a secretary, I don't adopt a public purpose and I award a contract to a favorite. Obviously, it's wrong. Now, those cases and many more cases could come under 13(1)(d) as it stood at that time. This new amendment is to protect the political class, completely to protect the political class. And what is the amendment? It now says that a public servant is said to commit an offense of a criminal misconduct. I'm skipping A, which talks of misappropriation. I'm coming to B. If he intentionally enriches himself illicitly during the period of his office. So if you intentionally enrich yourself illicitly during the period of your office. And the explanation is very interesting. In fact, the explanation controls the section. It says, a person shall be presumed to have intentionally enriched himself illicitly. A person shall be presumed to have intentionally enriched himself illicitly if he or any person on his behalf, so only he or any person on his behalf is in possession of or has at any time during the period of his office. So the period is also during the period of his office. Being in possession of pecuniary resources or property disproportionately to his known sources of income, which the public servant cannot satisfactorily account. Now, this gives out very new dimensions now. First of all, it sounds the death knell of all the prosecutions that took place under 13(1)(d). Earlier one, I would say, paid some lip service to corruption. Today, it is a bygone concept. You will not find cases of public corruption coming to, unless it's a trap case. Barring a trap case, those presumptive corruption cases which used to come to court will not be traveling to court anymore. Why? Because undue enrichment has to be of himself or any person on his behalf. Himself or any person on his behalf. A third person enrichment is excluded. Suppose in my tenure, I benefit Bharat Bhushan ji, and he keeps the benefit to himself. My tenure comes to an end. The period is over. Now, after the period, if Bharat Bhushan ji transfers anything to me, I'm not covered. You made it very easy for them. This is what the officers wanted. No officer in his tenure or during his period of his tenure is going to keep things in his own account or on his son's account. He will always keep it in a third person's account. And that third person has to only keep it till such time that the officer, his term comes to an end. Now, the only way you can prosecute an officer for enrichment, intentional enrichment, is when he has intentionally enriched himself or any person on his behalf, not a third person, and is in possession, or has at any time during the period of his office been in possession of peculiar resources or property disproportionate to a known source of income. So you've given him a getaway. So it has, this whole thing has become so loose, so open, that frankly speaking, I don't know how many cases of 13(1)B would now come to court, or what sort of inquiries would be held. That is why, if you see the new trend, there are less PC Act cases and more cases of money laundering. They would register a case under the IPC or the CP, or the IPC or the PC Act, which is pro forma, giving them PMLA authorities the opportunity to start their investigation, because they only need a specified offense. Once a specified offense is there, PMLA can start, action can start. So this is, as I said, this again, PC Act today stands consigned to the dustbin as far as government is concerned. You neither get permission, and if you get permission or approval for investigation, it will be qua what you've seen. I'm not talking of trap cases. Those are cases where somebody is caught red-handed taking money, but that doesn't happen with big people. That only happens with patwaris, peons, class 3, class 4 employees. I mean, 80%, you take the statistics of any state of India. I guarantee that 80 to 90% of your trap cases are only of very small people. At best, it will be an executive engineer once in a way. That's a big catch. No one else at all, because you can't even start an investigation. And where during investigation, I have seen those, that in Vyapam, they had cogent evidence against senior officers. No action. No action. So how does India want to improve its position before the world in terms of corruption index? You're not willing to recognize your corruption. You're not willing to look at your corruption. You're not willing to deal with your corruption. If you don't do that, how are you going to make yourself a better governing country? I'm speaking as I'm a nationalist. I love my country. For me, I mean, I remember this was 20 years back. I was Advocate General. I'm a little defiant also in my attitude on public issues. With Shiv Khera, we had launched a public movement called Country First. And when Shiv and I used to move from city to city, especially in central India, started from Jabalpur, Bhopal, Indore, Nagpur, Bilaspur, Raipur. Then Shiv went into Rajasthan, then Jharkhand, and all these cities. Not less than 30 to 50,000 people used to come to listen to us. From Chief Secretary downward, everybody would be sitting on chair in part of the audience. And even though I was a Congress appointed Advocate General when I was holding these conventions or these public meetings of Country First. Like, we would never invite a politician on the stage. I went to Bhopal, where we had a gathering of 50,000. It was sponsored by Dainik Bhaskar. The patriarch of Dainik Bhaskar, Ramesh Agrawal. It was, and corruption was the focus. The patriarch of Dainik Bhaskar, Ramesh Agrawal ji, who's no more now. There was so much of crowd, not only on the ground, but on the roads, peripheral roads, that he couldn't even reach the stage. This is the level of fight we've had on corruption. And I still remember, we would never invite our chief ministers because we thought that in public view, corruption starts from politics. And believe me, because of their good feelings for me, chief ministers would leave the town on that day so that they are not embarrassed. Whether it was Madhya Pradesh, whether it was Nagpur, whether it was Raipur, the then chief minister, I would actually thank their kindness. Jogi ji is not there; he's passed away. He was the chief minister in Chhattisgarh when we had gone to Raipur. He made sure that he was in Delhi on the day we had, and we got the police lines to hold that function also, which was the biggest ground, the police lines. So, as I said, the world has changed. There is a fight. People are fighting corruption. But how do you fight corruption if your laws are going to become so loose-ended? Then the intent to fight corruption doesn't seem to be. And how do you challenge those people who are doing wrong today? How do you challenge them? How do you challenge the senior bureaucracy or even the senior ministers for that matter? In India, you can't. It's only as a political, when you politically you want to chase them, that you will register cases against them. And those normally fail in court. But if you look at the law, I mean, I'm reading the law before you. Where is that cushion in law today to prosecute anybody? And for what? And instead of that, I mean, today, if a person who is from a commercial organization, a private body, now this is a new facet. I remember Sakshi mentioned this also. A person who is a commercial person, like he's an NGO, he could be a cooperative society, he could be a company, a private company, anything, a commercial organization. If it offers allurement to a public servant, you can prosecute him under the PC Act. So now from public servant, you are now pushing towards private people. You're protecting public servants and you're opening the gates to prosecute private people. Now, I feel this is harassment. Now, which private individual, if the government systems work well and are corruption free, would even like to go and pay money to them? Tell me which office in India, and I say this with a lot of responsibility, that you can just send a letter of your problem or complaint. Just send a letter and your your complaint gets redressed. The minimum that you have to do is to call up that person, meet that man, make a request, plead with him, even if you want to get a telephone repaired. You can't just put a complaint and do this. So, as I said, this facet again, I think is not a good facet. Public PC Act should have been confined to public men. Bringing in PC Act against commercial organizations, NGOs, is only a way of a government to control private actions, private individuals. It could be newspapers, it could be anybody else. Last, I would like to say that I still feel that the famous words of Justice J.S. Verma, "Be you ever so high, but the law is above you," is something which rings a bell always with me. I always think of those people, they had the courage of conviction to speak up to the best and the mightiest. And before I end, I just give you a few statistics. What are the pending trials as per National Bureau of Crime? Up to 16, because after 16 we don't have, at least in public domain. Pending trials is 22,107. Total cases is 25,582. Conviction rate, according to National Crime Bureau, it is 36.8%. Pendency rate is, according to the National Crime Bureau, 90.6%. Now, this talks of the criminal justice delivery system. I end by only saying, you are known by the system which delivers. The system we have inherited and which we have tried to take forward with the help of our laws. I can't say it is delivering. If it was delivering, the statistics and Transparency International's index would have been otherwise. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of all our viewers and bar, so thank you from the bottom of our heart. You have just discussed the law, giving us a holistic view and putting such, which actually gives the law a very bold perspective and a food of thought for all of us to really think upon it, sir. So it was a pleasure, sir, hearing you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, I would like to invite our speaker, Advocate Bharat Bhushan ji, to please decode the different sections of the law for us. Sir, I hope that this will also be a great learning from your practical experience, as it was in the last session when you have shared your great experience on the art of cross-examination. And sir will not only decode but also give an international perspective to various things which have been still left in our existing law, like sir was also talking about the commercial organization. They have recommended that the organization must have an adequate procedure in place, but what I think, there is nothing in our law to state what procedure, how it should be. So sir will be sharing an international perspective to it. So please.
Thank you very much, Madam Sakshi. But first of all, I would like to say that Mr. Tankha, in a very enlightened manner, has put forward the real perspective of the law of corruption as it is. Am I audible?
Yes,
And in a very dynamic manner, the things have been placed before us, that what the law is today, and he very short few words, he could say so much. It really speaks of his experience, speaks of his capabilities, and I will be now certainly adding certain things to that, because limitation of times were there before him, so perhaps he left out certain things for that reason. My learned friend, Mr. Tankha, has dealt with the historical perspective very vividly. I would like to just add a few things in that. If we go right from ancient period of our country, I am told that Kautilya writes about Mauryan period, and he says that there are 40 different types of corruption prevalent in our society. This is about our ancient civilization. And then thereafter, the corruption continues. It continues even during Mughal period, Sultanate, and it continues when East India Company came into being in our society, and then it continued, and it continues till today. Just as Mr. Tankha said, if things are known by the delivery, we are not able to deliver till today. So therefore, the corruption is very rampant. Anybody who's trying to say that now we are corruption free is perhaps trying to believe himself. Now, 1860, when criminal law was there, IPC came into being. Section 161 to 165 and 165A. Just as Mr. Tankha said, there were 6 sections only. These dealt with the corruption. And thereafter, after Second World War, of course, before Second World War period also, there had been attempts to deal with corruption because corruption was acknowledged and it was really very badly rampant. I would like to add one thing here. Today, we are a democratic polity. We are supposed to be ruled by law, not by any individual. Earlier, we were being ruled not in a democratic way, but by certain forces. And if I say that at that time, the people had to please those who ruled in order to get certain benefits or certain things. So therefore, this was but natural for corruption to be part of the whole system. And today, I will say that we are going through the period of transformation of our society. We have not completely transformed ourselves into a democratic polity. We are in the process of actually democracy getting imbibed right in the heart of the people. Sorry. Unless that process is complete, rule of law will remain as something which will not be so realized. So to rule of law become realistic, just as Mr. Tankha said, today, it is not the law, it is not the judiciary that will be able to ensure corruption-free society. So it has to come from the root of the people, from the people's mind itself. Once they start realizing that they are entitled to it, everybody feels sick of corruption. Everybody feels bad about corruption. Everybody talks against corruption. But when it comes to dealing with the things, everybody says that there is no chara hi nahi. Yahi karna padega yaar. So they feel like that, and with this kind of situation, although there have been some efforts, but the efforts have been inadequate, too inadequate, I should say. But just as after 1860, and after Second World War, 1944, criminal law amendment came that tried to tackle with the certain things of the corruption. Then thereafter, after that, soon after independence in 1947, we had Prevention of Corruption Act. This was a very short act, but quite comprehensive because it was in addition to the provisions contained in section 161 to 165 and 165A. Then 1952, there was an amendment, and thereafter, the basic law as it is today, after amendment of 2018, it was made in 1988. The differences which have come because of the amendment of 2018 by Reverend friend, Mr. Tankha has already dealt with that in a very good manner. I would also be dealing certain aspects of that. Now, I will come to some nitty-gritties of the law. First of all, thing is what we have to see is, though the law says that against a public servant, even investigation will start after permission from the court or from the government. Then after investigation, everything is found out, still sanction would be required before prosecution will start. For the private people, it can start at any point of time, any moment. So there won't be any problem with that. So now, since we are to deal with the public things, so I will say that public servant was sought to be defined in the 1988 Act, and this definition still continues. It was section 2C, which seeks to define public servant. And largely speaking, public servant, any government employee, whether of the central government or of the state government or of the local body or of any other body which is funded and financed by the central government, state government or local body. Public sector employees, for that matter, they are also public servants. And the society founded by government or were financed by the government would also cooperative society or otherwise other societies, they would also become that way. Their employees, their office bearers, they become public servants. Now here I would like to say one thing. There was an ASTRU, Association of State Road Transport Undertakings. I had occasion to be associated with that case at that time. Some of the employees were charged with having taken some bribe and they were removed from the service. I was dealing with them, their service matter at that time, and the criminal case was with somebody else. We filed a writ petition in Delhi High Court. The writ petition was dismissed. They said ASTRU is not a state, although it is this Association of State Transport Undertakings. All the undertakings were state governments bodies, and they were contributing to make that association. And association was financed by central government partly. Yes, of course, the certain fees they were collecting for services which they were rendering, but those fees were being collected from the state transport undertakings. So our plea was not accepted. This is a state, and the writ petition was dismissed. We had to file a civil case thereafter. That very judgment was then taken up by the person in the criminal court, and although the special court did not help him, but High Court said yes, it is. This does not amount to a case of corruption. So this is an aspect. Although there are many more cases thereafter where certain things have happened, where now it is very clear public sector undertakings, any undertaking which is being financed by the government, the same way as it was being done in case of ASTRU, they are all now being recognized as government bodies. So any person who is employed with them becomes a public servant. With that wide definition of public servant, a concept of public duty is also there that we have to see. And before I come to public duty, I would like to say yes, I would like to say about a case which was titled as P.V. Narasimha Rao versus State, 1998. It was decided the members of parliament, members of state assemblies, etc., they were also then dubbed as public servants. So MLAs, MPs, etc., they become public servants. Now I'll come to public duty. For state, public community, any person who is serving as a public servant, what does he do? Whatever he is doing is a public duty. And there are other bodies, just as we named, corporations established by the state, societies established by the state or financed by the state, or by the local bodies, etc., etc. All these, whatever they do, because they do something which is in the larger public interest, larger community interest. So these are all public duties which they do. So public duty has a very wider connotation as far as this part is concerned. Now, before I come to the changes in the law introduced in 2018 Amendment Act, I would like to say that when it comes to public servant, when it comes to public servant, actually section 7 used to apply at that time earlier. Now also section 7 applies. Section 7, 8 and 9 were there in 1988 Act. Those used to apply. Now all those are clubbed into section 7. 7A, B, C have been made and 7A has been created. And these give us as to what is to be done in case of public servants. But again, just as my beloved friend said, You can't even investigate today without the permission. You can't even file a case without the permission of the government. So that, of course, is there. And notwithstanding that, earlier the position was that was also historically developed. The position was finally, as it came into being, is that there is a requirement of twin requirement of demand being proved and acceptance being proved. Unless both the things were proved, nobody could be held guilty thereof of corruption under Section 7A. Of course, 8 and 9, the judgment results have come forward on that, but Section 8 and 9 earlier, they were, as far as language is concerned, pari passu with Section 7, and Section 13 also required the twin elements of demand being proved and acceptance of the bribe being proved. So now, at the top of it now, there is a requirement of taking permission for investigation and for filing case, that is obtaining sanction. Sanction earlier was also there, but then the law said earlier that even if the sanction is irregular, the case would not be stayed. Now, that part, that even if the law sanction is not regular, it will not be stayed, is no more there. So there has to be a proper sanction. There has to be a proper investigation permission. So as such, it has been very correctly said that things will not move. But Section 7 now, as my learned friend has said, it definitely still deals with the commercial organizations. If a commercial organization is offering bribe, it can be penalized. Although things may not start against the public servant. So Section 7 offences to the extent that now even for investigation, the permission is required, has really started becoming very difficult to be applied. And just as it was said, that if you are having clout in the government, whether you are in the government side or otherwise, if you have clout in the government, then permission will never be granted. But if you do not have the clout, then of course you run the risk of doing this. And so this is what about it. And the law has tried to enhance the punishment. So I think it was trying to make an impression before the public that we are very serious about it. So there is enhancement in the punishment which has taken place. Minimum punishment has now become 3 years, and the maximum is 7 years. Apart from that, just as I said, under the as per previous judgments, Section 7 required the twin things, requirement of demand and of acceptance. Now, demand, when you make a demand, if this is the requirement, then intention would there be there. If there is no intention, there can't be a demand. Anyhow, now in the change law, the word intention has been introduced. Right? Now, instead of saying, using the term gratification and all that, the term has become undue advantage. Now, undue advantage could be monetary or non-monetary. Even earlier also it could have been non-monetary. It's not that it is being introduced now, but a new terminology has come into being. So now, non-monetary considerations, if there are some, even that can be termed as a gratification, and that will become undue advantage. And Section 2D will take care of it. The law says that bribe is now undue advantage. So it will, that way, be dealing with that situation. Now, I will be talking of certain cases, although there have been some cases even before that. But the first case which came, where the requirement of demand was very properly focused, that was a case of B. Jayaraj versus State of Andhra Pradesh. Here, there was some recovery from the pocket of the person. The traffic policeman was there. There was some recovery from his pocket. And despite that recovery, he was let go, because the person who came in the witness box did not say that he had demanded that money from me. So the tainted money was recovered despite all that, because the word demand was not used by him. So that person was allowed to go. And this laid down the principle that demand is a sine qua non for conviction under Section 7 at that time. So the same situation still continues. It has not been, no change has been brought in that. And later judgments, Satyamurthy judgment is very highly celebrated judgment, Kishan Chandra judgment, they have very clearly laid down now that there is a twin requirement of demand as well as of the acceptance thereof. Now there could be situations where, say, the complainant is now dead at the time of trial. He will not come in the witness box to say that there was a demand or something, and nobody can cross-examine him if earlier recording whatever that was if not from. So how to deal with that kind of situation? It is, in fact, if a witness is dead, then you can't prove the demand. This is practically sealed into that situation. And complainant is dead, or the complainant turns hostile. Now, if a complainant turns hostile, there can be circumstances where it can still be proved. The complainant has turned hostile, he can be under Section 145 of Evidence Act confronted with his earlier written statements if there are any. Then in that situation, it can be brought on record, but while confronting him, it doesn't become an evidence. But when the IO will come, who had recorded his previous statement, if he says, yes, it was so recorded, he said so, and he can prove that, and if the court can rely upon his evidence, then that will amount to proof of the demand. So there is a third situation where the complainant cannot be examined. He is not traceable now. There is no information whether he is dead or alive. He has not appeared, so there is no question of his turning hostile. So the witness is not traceable now. If witness is not traceable, his evidence is not there. So in that situation, other evidences, if they are available, and from the other evidence, if demand can be proved, fine. If it cannot be proved, basically that is that situation. And it is possible, largely speaking, in trap cases still, because the person who is the complainant, there is a shadow witness generally with that, and the shadow witness, if he hears the demand, he speaks about the demand, then the demand stands proved. So this is what, generally speaking, in practice we will encounter these kind of things. And Section 7, I need not speak more on this because my learned friend has already dealt with that part. Now I will come to Section 8. It is dealing with the giving of bribe. Any person who gives or promises to give some undue advantage with the intention to induce a public servant or with the intention to reward such public servant to perform improperly some public duty or for performing some improper performance of public duty. Now, bribe giver, as my learned friend already said, will be booked in these kind of situations. But if he reports within 7 days about these things of having been compelled and that under compulsion he is giving this bribe, that in that situation, such a person can have an escape route. But 7 days time is the limit given to him. If he fails to do it within 7 days, because there can be circumstances where within 7 days he is not even able to file a report about that. So in that situation, he will be not allowed to go let free. Otherwise, if he reports within 7 days, yes, of course, then he can be allowed to go let free under the provisions of this Section 8. But in this, I may say again, in Section 7, it was provided that commercial organizations, they will have to bear the fine penalty So this private person who comes and gives, he may not be really doing his own work. He may be applied to some commercial organization, may be doing something for that. In that situation, when he has to inform about the compulsion that he is facing, he has to enclose with that he had the authority from the commercial organization he is representing, and then commercial organization is also taken the loop to file a report. Otherwise, commercial organization will be in the soup. So now I come to section 9. Section 9 actually deals with the commercial organizations as are likely to give bribe or giving bribes. And in fact, these amendments have come in response to United Nations conventions against corruption. There are other countries who have laws made on that. One part of law which my learned friend has dealt with is about public servants. About the public servants. Now, this is regarding commercial organization, the section 9 which it deals with. The commercial organization, if it has inbuilt structures in it to deal with any corruption activity by any of its employees, that in that situation, it will have an escape route. So it has to have a very strong, deep-rooted or setup within itself of providing provisions where the employees cannot indulge in corruption for the benefit of the commercial organization while dealing with the public servants, etc., in the discharge of their public duties. So if that kind of adequate procedure is there, and that adequate procedure is to be laid down in the rules, those rules have not yet been brought into force. So what would be adequate procedure here is actually not still laid down in black and white, but I will be dealing with certain international situations where adequate procedures are laid down and what are the kind of principles affecting that adequate procedure to safeguard the commercial organization. Now, any person on behalf of commercial organization, if gives a promise of any undue advantage with the intention to obtain or retain some business, or with the intention to retain an advantage or obtain an advantage in the conduct of the business, that in that situation, the commercial organization, of course, that person who does all that along with for the commercial organization, that because they are giving bribe, offering bribe, so they are going to be held responsible for it. Now, what is a commercial organization? Any body or a partnership firm which is incorporated in India and which carries on business whether in India or outside India. Once it is incorporated in India, may not be carrying the business inside India, may be carrying business outside India only. Still, it can become liable. It has to have adequate procedure within its work. Now, another thing is any body or a partnership or any body corporate which is incorporated outside India but has some business in India, anywhere in India, that also becomes answerable under this section 9 and has to have adequate procedure. Now I'll come to adequate procedure. Individuals, when they work in an individual capacity, there is no possibility of them having any adequate procedure. Small organizations in India, there are very, very small businesses. We have small scale industries, small scale enterprises, even startups now very small, and then medium scale. It's very difficult for them to have what is identified as adequate procedure. Now, because adequate procedure has not been laid down in our country as yet, I will deal with it slightly in a very short way. What is the concept of adequate procedure in certain advanced countries? For example, in UK, there is a Bribery Act of 2010. They have 6 principles which lay down as to what should be done by the private bodies to have their adequate procedure when they are dealing with the government bodies or any public service for that matter, or who are dealing with the persons who are doing public duties. So how they will be able to provide for adequate procedures. So I'll be dealing with this from taking example from the United Kingdom. 6 principles are laid down in the procedure set in the United Kingdom. Now, the first principle is proportionate procedures. Now, the word used is proportionate procedures. Just as I was saying, there are different types of organizations, very small organizations, medium-sized organizations, big organizations. The number one, this is aspect. What procedure we can have, it has to be proportionate to our capacity, because what we can do is within our own, it has to be within our own limitations. Then the proportionality of the procedure is from another aspect also. What kind of work we are going to do, what kind of business we are going to fetch from the government and all that. So in that, we have to have procedures in our organization. We have to show it very clearly that philosophy and the policy of our organization is that there shall be no hanky-panky thing, no bribery, etc. will be attempted from our side. Total commitment is there. If there are some written documents, it must mention those, and we must keep on harping on this, that there has to be total commitment to the no bribery, no corruption, and whenever these things come to our notice, then we will deal with that. Internal procedures have to be laid out for that. Now, second point which is to be taken care of in the proportionate procedures is mitigation of bribery risks. Now, when we do some business, in order to fetch business, we have to please certain people. We have to at least have some good relationship with certain people, and in good relationship, some hospitality gets introduced. Now, how to limit, how to regulate that hospitality so that it does not become so big that it starts influencing the public servant, or the public duty gets compromised. Now, one more thing which we have to identify and understand is that we as a commercial organization will always have an interest that there should be no corruption. If we are good, if we are competent. If we are not competent, still we are venturing into it, we may like to that there should be some corruption so that we can do that. We can do our business without being competent to do the business. Now, supposing somebody wants to take a contract for bridge building. If it's a huge bridge building, unless we have appropriate competent staff and where to procure the material, we will be doing due diligence. I'll be dealing with due diligence also in this. It is also required. Where to procure that material should be of good quality, and the technical staff that we have should be able to deliver properly, take care of all the aspects which are there, and then we should have systems of audit and all that, so that if anybody doing some hanky-panky thing is caught, and we are able to keep to the policy of no corruption. Just as I said, a commitment to anti-bribery will have to be there. Now, next thing is, which is this part of this is the overview of strategy and implementation of bribery prevention. So whenever the organization is there, it has to take an overview. When the things have happened, well, those things went fine or not, whether we were successful in preventing bribery and all that. So that means this has to be a post view. So this is the first principle out of the 6 principles that the private bodies are supposed to have. They have to have. First thing which I have said is this. The second is top level commitment. So this top level commitment, if the top persons of the organization are not committed to corruption-free working, naturally we will not be able to achieve a corruption-free working. So this has to be a very good commitment, and this commitment has to be conveyed to the right down to the organization, that there shall be no tolerance for the corruption, whatever be done, and whatever other 4 principles which I'll be talking of will be seriously implemented, and that will ensure that there is, of course, as Mr. Thika said, we can't have absolutely corruption-free things in our whole society, but will ensure that, largely speaking, we can work without corruption. So I will come to the third principle, that is risk assessment. Now, when we do certain work, there are certain types of risk, and we have to assess. If the risk is very high, then of course we'll have to be more vigilant, more careful. If there is low risk, we may not have even adequate procedures within our organization. So risk assessment has to be there, that if there is a high risk. So where are situations where there can be high risk? There are things where there can be high risk is, we have certain works which have no competition. Say, there is always high risk in that situation, that you will get work and there is no competition. How to determine the price? Even the price can be artificial. So in these kind of things, there will always be high risk. Or there is a very limited competition, then cartel formation can take place. So there may not be risk in this kind of situation. There will be very high risk in these kind of situations. So these are the external risks which I am talking of. There can be internal risks. Our technical person who say constructing the bridge, supervising that, has to use the raw materials. Now he compromises with the quality of the raw material, uses substandard material, and then those who come for the inspection, they have to pass whether the material is okay or not from within our organization and from the public sectors, public servants also. They will come. He will, out of the savings which he has made, he will try to bribe them. So that kind of situation will be there. So these kind of factors are internal factors. We have to have certain systems in vogue to control these kind of internal risks. So this is what is provided there. Now I come to the next principle, which is part of due diligence. Now I was just saying, due diligence is very important in any organization. There has to be due diligence, not only while procuring the raw materials, just as I gave the example of constructing a bridge, not only procuring the raw materials, but hiring specialists from outside, hiring employees for ourselves also, who have to be very technically sound, properly educated, properly trained. And since the previous training may not be enough, there has to be continuous training, in-house trainings also, where we have to ensure those are given. So these things require that when we hire such kind of services, we do due diligence before we settle for some service from outside or from within. Now, after this due diligence, there is next concept of business opportunity risk. Now, this I have already slightly said about this, that to business opportunities can be very competitive, or there could be no competition. If there is no competition, although there is nobody else to do the same thing for the government, perhaps we are the only, or we have some cartel, we few could do. So then in that situation, we are able to dictate price, we are able to dictate that we will do this work, but still there can be certain things, because high price can be fixed, certain things can be there. And if we are very competitive, then again, to create certain edge in the competition, certain persons can do that. So therefore, we have to have certain internal systems to ensure that in these kind of circumstances, our people are not doing that kind of thing. So the next very important is communication. This principle of communication and training, I would say both the things together. Communication down from the top to the bottom of organization, that we shall not tolerate corruption. It has to be corruption free totally. And training for that purpose proper training has to be given, atmosphere has to be created, culture has to be created within our organization, which does not propagate or reward any corruption for that matter. So one thing which is called here is, if we have a system of speak up, that means people are allowed to speak, file a complaint against somebody who's doing the wrong things. My learned friend, Reverend friend, Mr. Tanka also said, when we have no such system of giving protection to those who will speak against the corruption, then in that situation, nobody will speak up about the corruption. And if somebody speaks up, if no investigation will be carried out in the government sectors, then in that situation, speaking up will not be rewarded at all. And then within the private organization also, I'm saying, the concept of speak up has to be there. And that speak up provisions, allowing persons to file complaints and ensuring that the complaint remains confidential. The person who files a complaint or tells about something wrong thing happening, he is giving adequate protection. So this is a very important principle. And then, just as I said, communication and training. Communication is not just giving lectures. It should be seen and being practiced, being implemented in the organization. So that makes the communication effective. And last but not the least important is monitoring and review. Commercial organizations have to have monitoring system. Something which is being done, there should be some system to monitor that no hanky-panky happens. And then after the old things are over, there should be review. Audit, post-audit, all these things should be concurrent audit and post-audit. These should be the very important things which must be there. My learned friend has already dealt with what has been done to section 13. He has dealt with the one aspect. Now, one more aspect which he left out. I'm just going to deal with that in a very summary manner. There are now only two things left in the section 13. Earlier there were 5 subsection A, B, C, D, E. Now there are only 2. If he allows himself or any other person to dishonestly or fraudulently misappropriate or convert to his own use the property which he is given to him and trusted to him or is under his control. If anything of this sort is happening, and if this is now brought to the notice, then in that situation, section 13 can be invoked. The other portion, my learned friend has already dealt with that I'm not going to say on that. So with this, section 13. Again, I will say, as has been held out in various judgments of the honorable courts, again, here, 2 things. Twin requirement of demand and acceptance will have to be brought forth. Otherwise, even this misconduct will not be there. So this will not be dealing with that. So now, I will come shortly on certain cases. We are all aware how much Allah Gulla was there on the 2G scam, and 7 years the learned trial judge was sitting on that, asking the bodies to come forward with their evidence, whatever they had. In fact, he writes in the judgment, it is over 1500 pages judgment. He writes that there was no evidence brought before him, and that 2G scam, everybody has been acquitted. There is no evidence at all in the entire things. And it has been rightly pointed out in that judgment that, in fact, the terms which were used, the whole process which was conducted, that was not clear to the officers dealing with that. They did not do anything about that. So, in fact, here I would like to say, when the new things happen, whether because of the technology or because of some policy changes, new things happen. Our past experience is not there to deal with those kind of things. So we may have certain technical difficulties to deal with that. And in that situation, certain wrong may happen. Sarkaji very rightly pointed out that if I give some contract to somebody known to be approachable without following the due process and all that, in that situation, corruption is there. So in this 2G also, although the Honorable Supreme Court had held, the contracts were cancelled. So the corruption was there, but these persons are not responsible for corruption. So this is the situation as far as 2G scam is concerned. Now, another case, other society scam. There, a very popular case, very well-known case of Chief Minister Mr. Chauhan was there. In the first instance, what had happened is the governor had not given sanction. He did not give sanction because there was no evidence. He discusses in his odd sanction order how there is no evidence against the Chief Minister, Mr. Chauhan, and so therefore no sanction was given. Then the government changes, governor changes, so not the government, the governor changes. Then the next governor who comes, on the same material, he gives sanction. Now here is a question of law, which in that case it was dealt, Bombay High Court dealt with that. Can there be a review of the sanction on the same material? No, there is no provision in the law for review of the sanction. So sanction could not have been there. Despite having observed this, the Bombay High Court analyzed the case in the whole length, detail, and further gave an observation: there is no material connecting Mr. Chauhan with the so-called corruption in that case, in that scam. So therefore, Mr. Chauhan, no sanction could be upheld properly. So it was not only from that perspective, it was from this perspective also that not only from technical aspect that there could not be review, it was from this perspective also that there was no material linking anything of Mr. Chauhan with that so-called corruption. Now, beneath the rise judgment, my learned friend has already dealt with that. And Subramanian Swamy and Manmohan Singh's case in that. This was very clearly said. This has also been dealt with by Mr. Tankha. So now I will deal with Mr. Devinder Kumar versus CBI. Here again, Section 17A is in question. My learned friend has dealt with Section 17A in a very good length and very vividly. He said what Section 17A says, and in this judgment, in this Devinder Kumar's judgment, Section 17A was considered by the Honorable Court, and the FIR was not quashed. The court said, in those circumstances, 17A was not retracted. Why? I will deal with that little bit. In fact, there was one Mr. Sana who had filed a complaint of demand of 5 crore rupees. This is a complaint basically against Mr. Sana, then Joint Director, CBI. So whether the complaint can be pursued further because against so many people. One Mr. Devinder Kumar was there, who was the superintendent in that case. So there were certain raids, certain time Mr. Sana was called for investigation for certain things. And he says he had entered into some understanding with certain private people. Those private people had said that they will be dealing with these government officials and all that. Although there was, at that time, there was no evidence, nothing was brought on record whether the government officials were dealing with that third person through whom the money of about 3 crore rupees out of 5 crore settled had already traveled. So, since it was still under investigation and the Honorable Court held that Section 17A was not retracted in that situation, so therefore, this case, this inquiry could continue. This is what our Honorable High Court of Delhi had at that time. Subramanian Swami's case and Dr. Manmohan Singh's case, Youth Bar Association case, these are all cited and those are used with. And in this case, another thing was there, section 13(1)(d) was also complaint in that case was there. Since this complaint had been given after July 2018 when the new amendment had come into being. So section 13(1)(d) was not there. The court said yes, if it is not there, fine, it will not be looked into, it is no more a crime. So this will, since it is no more a crime, so it will not be looked into. As far as section 8(1) is concerned, just as we discussed earlier what section 8(1) is, it deals with the bribe givers. So that kind of situation was said that let it be investigated into. So in that case, 17A was not deemed to be applicable in these circumstances. So basically, with this case, the question petition was premature. This is what the court said. FIR could be written against certain people, private people and all that. So FIR would not be questioned that time because it called for further investigation. Allegations are serious. So with this, today's time is over and I will have to conclude it today again in this way. I thank you all for giving me patient hearing, and I thank Mr. Tanka especially. He has very vividly spoken about things and very tersely placed as to what is the scope of prevention of corruption in our country under the present scenario. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir, for decoding all the sections and giving a practical, sharing a practical experience in all the sections. What I can summarize here is that our speakers have given us a food of thought on our plate, that whether the amendment in the Prevention of Corruption Act, the existing legislation, is actually to prevent the public servants or to actually curb corruption in our country. We need to think on this. And as Bharat sir correctly pointed out, that we can only remove corruption from our country when it will come from our roots. So we all should say a big no to corruption to make our country corruption free. Thank you so much. I, on behalf of Rouse Avenue Bar Association, thank our speakers to give us such a nice food of thoughts to all of us, to decode all the sections for us. And they have taken out so much time from their busy schedule. I really thank Vivek sir and Bharat sir for taking out time and sharing their experiences and giving a lot of learning and giving a lot of learning to our viewers. I really thank both our speakers. And also kudos again to the Rouse Avenue Bar Association, the initiative that they have taken. Again, I'll request all our professional colleagues to please help us know on what topics you would like us to conduct the session, and we will definitely gonna bring the same to you. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great learning and enjoyed the session. Thank you so much. Please subscribe to the channel and Facebook page so that you can get all the latest updates. And we are able to achieve the initiative that we have taken to contribute to the learning perspective. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, everybody, sir.
Are you?